Our possessions, our things, our stuff can often get in the way of us living a purposeful and intentional life. And so in this video, I want to share with you 8 habits that I think will help you to own less stuff as a way to live a more intentional life. Let's get started. The first habit is to declutter regularly. Unfortunately, decluttering is not a one and done type of thing. And if we don't set aside time in our routine, in our daily or weekly or monthly life to make time to declutter, that clutter will often creep back up because ultimately we are constantly bringing things into our home. It's inevitable and there's nothing wrong with that. But if we're not making time, setting aside time to declutter and to evaluate our possessions and our belongings and see what we no longer need, what we no longer use, that clutter is just going to keep creeping up on us and it's going to accumulate and accumulate, and it's not going to make it very easy for us to maintain in the long run. So we need to make sure that decluttering regularly is part of our routine as a way to own less and live a more intentional life. The second habit to adopt is to follow the one in, one out rule. Now I say that a little bit loosely because I don't entirely agree with this rule. I don't think that just because you purchase an item, you have to declutter something else or get rid of something else. I think it has to be within reason. So for example, if you purchase a new kitchen utensil, like you needed a new spatula, I don't think you have to run around your house looking for something to declutter just because you bought a new spatula. But if you bought that spatula to replace an older broken one that you no longer use, that is where I think the one in, one out rule applies. So make sure that when you are replacing an item that is broken or that you don't use, that you actually declutter it after it's been replaced. That one came in, the other one can go out. Or likewise, if you purchase a new clothing item, maybe nothing that you own is particularly old or ruined or should be decluttered necessarily, but that's a good opportunity to reevaluate. If you did purchase a new clothing item, reevaluate your clothing and see if there's something that you can let go of as a way to keep your inventory manageable and again, to prevent clutter from accumulating over time. The third habit is mindful purchasing. For me personally, it took a while to realize that I wasn't purchasing mindfully because when you say that, you think, well, of course I'm going to purchase mindfully. I'm not just going to buy everything and anything. But sometimes we do buy things without really thinking about why we're buying it. And so being a little bit more mindful and asking yourself, like, does this align with my values? Do I truly need this item? Am I buying it because it's trendy right now? Do I think that I need it, but it's something that's just going to be purchased and then sit in my home unused? By doing this, we can also help avoid those impulse purchases and impulse buys because we'll actually think through why we're purchasing it as opposed to just buying it because we saw it and it looked cute. Not to say that you can't purchase something simply because it brings you joy, but really we should be more intentional with our purchasing and mindful about it. Every item that we bring into our home should serve a purpose, whether it adds value to our lives, whether it just brings us joy in some way. If we're just bringing in item after item because we impulsively bought it or it was trending, it's a great way to have that clutter creep back up into your home. So being more mindful with your purchasing will definitely help you to own less ultimately and live more intentionally as a result. The fourth habit to adopt is purchasing quality over quantity. This is something that can be hard to do at first, especially if you're a little more frugal. I know that myself, I tend to love going to thrift stores and shopping for clothing there because it seems so practical to get secondhand items, and not to say that that's not a good thing to do. But at the end of the day, when I evaluate things, a lot of the items that I purchased at thrift stores ended up not holding up very long, and I'd have to buy more and more and more, and it seems like all of that money spent could have been used to buy maybe a few quality items of clothing that would last me a long time. And it's not just clothing, but other categories of items as well. I think if you start to look for quality as opposed to quantity and trying to get past that barrier of, well, it's a really good price, it's cheap, but ultimately down the road, you'll notice you're probably spending more money in the long run on the cheaper items than if you had invested upfront in a few quality pieces. So thinking about it that way, it can help us, again, to own less because we're not purchasing as much. We're purchasing fewer, but better quality, and that can help us to be a little bit more intentional with what we're bringing into our homes. Habit number 5, and this is one of my favorites, is to borrow or rent. We don't need to own every single item that we might need. So for example, I like to bake, I bake a lot, and I don't have a stand mixer, but sometimes there's a recipe I want to make that calls for a stand mixer. It's not every day, and I have a small kitchen. It's not really an item that I want to store in my kitchen because it's a big item, so I borrow it from my mom. It's few and far between that I actually use it. Is it a bit of an inconvenience to have to bring it from my mom's house, use it, and then return it to her? Sure. But for the few times that I actually use it, I don't mind, because it saves me the hassle of having to store it in my kitchen, having to maintain it and make sure that it's, kept well and cleaned and all of that. So I don't mind borrowing it. And I think if we look at items this way, we can significantly reduce the amount of stuff that we own. I gave the example of a kitchen like small appliance, but this applies to all kinds of things like tools that you don't use all the time. Borrow them from a neighbor or a family member or a friend. Other types of equipment can apply to books. Obviously, you can borrow from a library or from a friend. Even special clothing items. Like, I personally only own right now one special occasion dress, but there have been times where I borrowed a dress from my mom or my sister because I don't need to own multiple formal wear items when I go to a wedding or an event so rarely. So by borrowing or renting items, it can significantly reduce the amount of stuff that you own. Next habit is to digitalize. We live in a world where it is so simple now more than ever to minimize our paper clutter. And paper clutter is one of those things that just will keep creeping up because there's always more paper coming in one way or another. So if you can digitalize your documents, your photos, your kids' artwork, things that you can just limit the amount of actual physical clutter, you will feel such a weight lifted. Great way to reduce the physical clutter in your home and to own less stuff. Number 7 is to practice gratitude. I feel like this should have been higher on the list, but a good way ultimately to own less is to cultivate a mindset of gratitude for the stuff that you already have, for the stuff that you already own. By doing this, by appreciating the things that you already have in your life, it can definitely help you resist that urge to always accumulate more. It ultimately helps you be content with less. It helps you to be content with what you have and to be grateful for what you have. And you just don't feel, like I said, that urge to want more and more all the time because you're just appreciative for everything that you do own. And the last habit is to set limits. At the end of the day, something I've learned is that you have to set boundaries for certain categories of belongings. Whether it's clothes or books or kitchen gadgets, those boundaries can either be set by like a physical number of what you're comfortable with, or it's set by the restrictions of your home. Like if you have a small kitchen and you don't have a ton of storage, that is the boundary. What you have to work with is the boundary. If your closet or your dresser only holds so much, that's the boundary. You can't continue to accumulate and stuff the drawers and stuff the closet. I mean, you could, but that would get very overwhelming very quickly. And the whole point of this is to try and work on owning less. And to do that, setting these boundaries is really going to help us. Limiting the number of items in each of these categories, whether it's clothing or books or kitchen gadgets or whatever it might be. Limiting a number or limiting a space to what we can physically contain encourages more mindful consumption because we know we only have so much space for these items. So we're not going to continue to buy and buy and buy because we just don't have the space for it. And that ultimately leads to excess stuff in our home. So setting limits is a great habit to adopt when it comes to owning less as a way to live more intentionally. It may not happen overnight, but by slowly adopting some of these habits into your daily life, it's a great way to gradually reduce the amount of stuff that you own and create a more peaceful and organized living space. We have to keep in mind, and sometimes we forget this, but owning less isn't about deprivation. We're not trying to just get rid of everything and deprive ourselves of stuff as a way to keep the peace in our home. It's just about making space for the stuff that is important to us, so we don't feel like we have to push the important things aside because we've got too much other stuff to manage. It's ultimately about making space for those important and essential things that matter to us most. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope you got some value from this video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe for more content all about minimalism and slow, intentional living. I will see you in my next video.